The new year opened with wishes of peace, joy, and prosperity. Across Nigeria, families prayed that 2026 would finally be a year without fear, without explosions in the night, without sirens, without the quiet dread that has followed too many communities for too long. But just days into the year, a different sound cut through the hope. Not a gunshot, not a bomb, a declaration. On Christmas Eve and again days later, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu released statements that sent shockwaves far beyond the Middle East. He announced what he called a new front, a mission to protect Christians wherever they are persecuted. Then he named countries: Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, and unmistakably repeatedly Nigeria. The words were framed as protection, as solidarity, as moral duty. He openly referenced coordination with the United States and conversations with Donald Trump describing a shared struggle to defend what he called the Judeo-Christian tradition. At the same time, U.S. airstrikes struck suspected terrorist camps in northern Nigeria, including areas around Sokoto. For some, those bombs meant relief. For others, they meant something far more dangerous. Because Nigeria is not a simple story of one faith against another. It is a nation where Muslims and Christians trade in the same markets, sit in the same homes, bury victims from the same terrorist attacks. Boko Haram bandits and armed groups have killed Muslims and Christians alike. And yet suddenly, global powers were speaking as if Nigeria were a religious battlefield, dividing victims into categories and protection into sides. So tonight we must slow down and ask the question no one wants to ask out loud. Is foreign intervention truly about ending terrorism, or is it quietly turning religion into a weapon? And if outside forces claim they can tell the difference between Muslim and Christian from the sky, what happens to the innocent families on the ground? This story is not just about Nigeria. It is about Africa's future, about sovereignty, about whether faith will be used to heal or to fracture nations already under strain. As this unfolds across Africa news cycles, the consequences may reach far beyond one country. Please share this video if you believe truth matters more than headlines. Subscribe if you think Africa's stories deserve to be told with honesty. And tell us in the comments, is this protection or the beginning of something far more dangerous? The chain of events did not begin with bombs. It began with words carefully chosen, publicly delivered, and globally amplified. On December 24th, as Christians around the world prepared for Christmas, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu released a video message outlining what he described as a moral obligation. He declared that the persecution of Christians or members of any faith cannot and must not be tolerated. Then he went further, naming Muslim militant displacement and attacks against Christians in Nigeria and insisting that this violence must end, and it must end now. Nigeria was not mentioned in passing. It was singled out, listed, repeated, placed alongside Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, and other regions long associated in Western media with sectarian violence. The message framed Nigeria as a frontline in a broader civilizational struggle, one that Israel claimed it was now prepared to confront with intelligence, coordination, and force. Days later, on December 30th, Netanyahu released another video. Again, Nigeria was mentioned. Again, the language was uncompromising. He spoke about protecting minorities, especially Christians, not only in the Middle East but in Africa. He emphasized that Israel was capable of helping capable in ways he deliberately refused to itemize: intelligence, means, force. And then came a statement that shifted the tone from concern to coordination. He confirmed that he had spoken directly with Donald Trump, presenting the situation as part of a shared global battle. In Netanyahu's framing, this was not simply counterterrorism, it was ideological. He spoke openly of a battle against the Judeo-Christian tradition, one that he claimed stretched from Europe to the United States and down into Africa, with Nigeria now firmly inside that arc. Terrorism, he said, should not be understood, but confronted and defeated. Faith, he argued, must speak, not remain silent. Almost simultaneously, the military reality on the ground in Nigeria changed. The United States carried out airstrikes on suspected terrorist camps in northern Nigeria, including areas in and around Sokoto. These strikes were presented as precision operations aimed at armed groups responsible for years of violence. To some Nigerians, particularly those who had lost relatives to insurgent attacks, this appeared to be long overdue assistance. But for others, the timing was impossible to ignore. There was no clear public explanation from the Nigerian government. No national address detailing the scope of cooperation. No transparent outline of who authorized what and under what conditions. Instead, Nigerians were left to connect the dots themselves: Israeli declarations, American bombs, and a sudden global narrative portraying Nigeria as a religious battleground. That silence became part of the event itself. In a country as complex as Nigeria, where Muslims and Christians have lived side by side for generations, ambiguity is dangerous. Boko Haram bandits and armed groups have killed indiscriminately Muslims, Christians, farmers, traders, children. Yet the international framing now seemed to sort victims by faith, assigning protection selectively rather than collectively. And this is where the tension deepened. Nigerians began asking questions that had no easy answers. Why was Nigeria being discussed alongside Middle Eastern war zones? Why were foreign leaders defining Nigeria's internal crisis in religious terms? And why did help arrive as bombs before dialogue? What should have been a narrow counterterrorism operation was quickly interpreted as something larger, a test of sovereignty, a reshaping of narrative, and possibly a prelude to deeper involvement. The main event then was not just the airstrike. It was the moment Nigeria's internal security struggle was pulled onto a global ideological stage without the consent or clarity its people deserved. This set the conditions for what came next: anger, fear, gratitude, and resistance often existing side by side in the same streets. The moment the airstrikes were confirmed and the statements from abroad began circulating widely, Nigeria's fragile calm cracked open. What followed was not a single reaction, but a collision of emotions, gratitude, and rage, fear, and defiance unfolding at the same time, often in the same neighborhoods. The climax of this story emerged through the voice of an ordinary Nigerian Muslim who spoke not with political polish, but with raw conviction. His message was direct, emotional, and impossible to ignore. He addressed the United States, Israel, and especially Donald Trump not as a diplomat but as a citizen who believed his country was being misrepresented to the world. "We are not scared of death," he said. "We were born knowing that every soul will taste death." His words echoed deeply across northern Nigeria, where communities, Muslim and Christian alike, have buried victims of terrorism for years. The anger in his voice was not aimed at Christians. It was aimed at what he saw as a dangerous lie, the claim that Nigerian Muslims are the enemy of Nigerian Christians. He rejected that narrative completely. According to him, Muslims and Christians in Nigeria share markets, businesses, meals, and grief. When bandits attack villages, they do not ask for identity cards. When bombs explode, they do not separate victims by faith. Boko Haram armed gangs and extremist groups have killed Muslims and Christians together, and both communities have condemned those crimes repeatedly. Yet now he argued global powers were speaking as if Nigeria were divided neatly along religious lines. That accusation ignited the emotional peak of the video. The speaker accused foreign leaders of manipulating faith to justify intervention, warning that religion was being turned into a tool of division rather than protection. "You're trying to put hatred between Muslims and Christians," he said. "But we will not hate ourselves. We will eat together. We will sit together. We will do business together." His most chilling line followed: "If you want to kill us together." This was not bravado. It was defiance born of exhaustion. At the same time, the video cut sharply to a different reality. A series of clips showed Nigerians, many identifying as Christians, openly thanking Donald Trump and the United States for the airstrikes. Some spoke from northern Nigeria, praising the intervention as timely rescue. Others called it a blessing on Christmas Day. "God bless America," they said. "We need more of this help." These opposing reactions formed the heart of the crisis. On one side were Nigerians who felt abandoned for years, now relieved that anyone was acting decisively against terror. On the other were Nigerians who believed that the same action threatened to tear the country apart by redefining terrorism as a religious conflict rather than a criminal one. The divide was no longer theoretical. It was visible, emotional, and dangerous. What made the situation even more volatile was the absence of a strong, unifying message from within Nigeria itself. Without a clear national narrative, foreign voices filled the vacuum. Videos circulated faster than explanations. Clips fueled outrage faster than facts, and every new statement from abroad intensified the sense that Nigeria's crisis was being narrated by outsiders. This is where fear quietly replaced anger. Many Nigerians began asking a question that lingered beneath every reaction. If foreign powers claim they can protect one group, how do they identify targets? How do bombs distinguish between Muslim and Christian homes? How do intelligence reports separate extremist from neighbor in crowded cities and mixed communities? Those questions are not academic, they are existential. The climax of this story, then, was not just the shouting or the praise, it was the realization that Nigeria stood at a crossroads. One path led toward collective resistance against terrorism as a shared national struggle. The other risked transforming that struggle into a religious fault line amplified by global politics and external agendas. And once a society begins to fracture along faith, history shows that the damage can last generations. As the emotional dust began to settle, the deeper consequences started to surface not on television screens, but in the daily lives of ordinary Nigerians. Markets reopened with caution, conversations softened, then stopped altogether. In communities where Muslims and Christians had lived side by side for decades, people began choosing their words carefully, unsure of how the other might interpret the global storm now hovering over their country. The most immediate consequence was psychological. Fear does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it arrives quietly through suspicion. Parents wondered whether their children were safe walking to school. Shopkeepers questioned whether a casual argument could suddenly be framed as something larger. Clerics, both Muslim and Christian, felt pressure to reassure their followers while distancing themselves from narratives they did not create. For civilians, the danger was not just terrorism, it was mislabeling. When foreign leaders describe Nigeria's crisis in religious terms, they unintentionally or deliberately redefine entire communities. A Muslim villager risks being viewed as a suspect. A Christian neighborhood risks being framed as a protected zone. That kind of framing fractures trust at the most local level, where survival depends on cooperation, not division. Politically, the consequences were just as serious. Nigeria's federal government found itself in an impossible position. On one hand, no responsible state rejects help in the fight against terrorism. On the other, sovereignty is not merely about borders, it is about narrative control. By allowing external actors to publicly define Nigeria's internal crisis, the state risks appearing weak, reactive, or complicit in a story it did not author. The absence of a strong, unified national address deepened the uncertainty. There was no clear explanation of the scope of cooperation with the United States. No firm reassurance that all Nigerians, Muslim, Christian, or otherwise, were equally protected. Silence in moments like this does not calm tensions. It amplifies them. Within political circles, concerns quietly multiplied. Lawmakers and analysts questioned what precedent had been set. If foreign airstrikes could occur without transparent public consent, what would come next? Intelligence operations advisors. A prolonged presence justified under the banner of protection, history across Africa has shown that such paths rarely remain narrow. Religious leaders, meanwhile, faced a delicate balancing act. Muslim leaders condemned terrorism, yet rejected collective blame. Christian leaders welcomed protection, but feared being used as justification for escalation. Many urged restraint, warning that faith must not be weaponized. But their voices struggled to compete with louder international declarations. At the heart of the political fallout was a single unresolved issue: trust. Trust between citizens and the state. Trust between communities. Trust that counterterrorism would remain focused on criminals, not identities. When that trust erodes, governance becomes reactive, not proactive. Security becomes militarized, not communal. And politics shifts from problem-solving to damage control. The most troubling consequence was the long-term one. Children growing up in this climate absorb narratives before they understand history. If they learn that safety depends on religion rather than citizenship, the seeds of future conflict are quietly planted. Nations do not fracture overnight. They fracture slowly through repeated moments when fear is left unanswered. This phase of the story is not about bombs or speeches. It is about what lingers afterward: doubt, hesitation, and the creeping sense that Nigeria's unity is being tested by forces far beyond its borders. Whether the country emerges stronger or more divided will depend not on foreign agendas, but on how Nigerians themselves reclaim the narrative of who they are. From Washington's vantage point, Nigeria is not just a country in crisis, it is a strategic hinge. With Africa's largest population, one of its most complex religious landscapes, and a long-running insurgency that spills across borders, Nigeria has increasingly been viewed through a security-first lens. For policymakers in the United States, counterterrorism cooperation in West Africa has long been framed as a necessity, not a choice. In that framework, airstrikes and intelligence sharing are presented as technical solutions, targeted actions against armed groups disconnected from politics or religion. Yet reality rarely follows the script. When intervention is narrated publicly as the defense of one faith community, it changes how those actions are perceived on the ground. What Washington may see as precision security, Nigerians may experience as selective protection or worse, as the internationalization of an internal fracture. The American public, particularly older viewers who remember Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, understands this pattern well. Each of those interventions began with limited goals and moral language. Each promised stability, and each revealed over time how difficult it is to separate counterterrorism from nation-shaping once foreign power enters the equation. Nigeria now appears uncomfortably close to that familiar crossroads. From Jerusalem, the calculus is different. For the Israel, the language of defending religious communities resonates deeply with its own national narrative. By linking Nigeria to a broader struggle across the Middle East and beyond, Israeli leaders frame their involvement as part of a global moral campaign. But global campaigns rarely account for local nuance. Nigeria's history of coexistence, tension, compromise, and resilience does not fit neatly into binary categories of protector and protected. Across Europe, reactions have been cautious. Diplomats understand the risk of escalation in a country where religion intersects with ethnicity, land disputes, poverty, and politics. Quiet concerns circulate about precedent if Nigeria's crisis is openly redefined in religious terms. What stops similar framing elsewhere in Africa? The Sahel, already fragile, could become the next stage for ideological competition disguised as security assistance. At the multilateral level, institutions like the United Nations emphasize sovereignty and inclusive solutions. Official statements stress that terrorism must be confronted without stigmatizing communities. Yet such language often lags behind events. By the time diplomatic caution arrives, narratives have already taken root, spread by viral videos, emotional speeches, and selective images. What the global perspective reveals is a disconnect. Outside powers speak in terms of strategy, deterrence, and moral duty. Inside Nigeria, people speak in terms of survival, dignity, and coexistence. One side measures success by targets hit, the other measures it by whether neighbors still trust one another the next morning. For the world, Nigeria is a test case. Can international actors assist without redefining identity? Can counterterrorism remain focused on criminals rather than communities? Or will Africa once again become a stage where global agendas play out, leaving local societies to absorb the consequences? These questions matter far beyond Nigeria. They shape how African news is written, how alliances are justified, and how future interventions will be explained. And for Nigerians watching these developments unfold, the stakes are clear. If the world insists on seeing their country through a religious lens, it may miss the very unity that has kept Nigeria standing through decades of adversity. As this chapter closes, one truth stands uncomfortably clear. Terrorism is not Nigeria's only enemy. Division is. And division rarely arrives by force alone. It arrives through stories, labels, and narratives imposed faster than communities can respond. Nigeria has endured years of violence from armed groups that recognize neither mosque nor church. Muslim farmers and Christian traders have buried their dead side by side. That shared grief is the country's strongest defense. When outside powers frame Nigeria's pain through a single religious lens, they risk weakening the very fabric that has allowed communities to survive together. The warning here is not abstract. History shows that when counterterrorism becomes intertwined with identity, civilians pay the price. Bombs do not check faith. Intelligence reports do not read hearts. Once suspicion replaces citizenship, trust erodes, and rebuilding it can take generations. What begins as protection can end as polarization. This moment also raises a larger question about sovereignty. A nation's security is not only about defeating armed groups, it is about who defines the problem and who controls the solution. When Nigeria's crisis is narrated primarily by foreign leaders, the country risks losing ownership of its own story. And without ownership, accountability drifts outward while consequences remain local. Across the continent, leaders and citizens are watching closely. From the Sahel to the Horn of Africa, many ask whether this is a one-off response or a template for future interventions. The debate unfolding in Nigeria today echoes conversations happening elsewhere about self-reliance, dignity, and the right of African nations to solve African problems without being recast as symbols in global ideological struggles. For American viewers, especially those who remember how well-intended interventions unfolded in past decades, this should sound familiar. Limited actions rarely stay limited. Moral language often expands mandates. And societies with deep internal diversity suffer the most when solutions are rushed from afar. So the final question returns to Nigerians themselves and to those who claim to stand with them. Will this moment be used to strengthen national unity against terrorism, or to fracture it along lines that extremists themselves could only dream of creating? The answer will not come from speeches abroad. It will come from whether Nigerians are allowed the space, respect, and sovereignty to confront terror without being divided by it. As Africa News continues to cover these developments, the world would do well to listen to voices calling for coexistence rather than confrontation. Across West Africa, including in Burkina Faso, where figures like Ibrahim Traore speak often about sovereignty and internal strength, the message is increasingly the same: security without unity is an illusion. Please share this video if you believe Africa's future should be shaped by its people, not by imposed narratives. Subscribe if you think truth, context, and restraint matter more than headlines. And tell us in the comments, can Nigeria defeat terrorism without losing itself, and will the world allow it to try?